Like many people upon encountering Over the Garden Wall, Rob Sorcher was confused. "I don't understand this," the executive vice president of Cartoon Network told Patrick McHale, glancing over the project storyboards. The art showed two half-brothers exploring a haunting dream world that was a cross between a Germanic fairy tale and colonial America. The older brother, Wirt, wears a pointy red gnome hat and a Civil War-era cape. He fusses, bumbles, and recites romantic poetry as he searches for a way home. His younger brother, Greg, sports green overalls, wears an upside-down teapot on his head, and consults a companion frog, called Kitty, Jason Funderberker, Dr. Cucumber, or any number of other names. And like the audience, Wirt and Greg are mystified as to how they arrived in Over the Garden Wall's spooky wonderland. McHale assured Sorcher that the story would generally make sense, and that the script would generally be funny. It would also look beautiful, because animation veteran Nick Cross would be the art director. "It's going to be fine," McHale told Sorcher. "It's not going to be terrible. Even if it's not great, it'll be good." "That's a good point," Sorcher said. "I don't understand what this is, but keep going." There are many contenders in Cartoon Network's storied history for the best show they've ever made. Whether you're a classical cartoons fan who enjoys the likes of Dexter's Laboratory or the Powerpuff Girls, or a more contemporary fan who spends hours on Twitter debating between the likes of Adventure Time, Steven Universe, or Regular Show as top dog. If you've been on the animation side of the internet for all of 5 seconds, then you've no doubt come across such debates and discussions as to which CN show is truly the best, and know how absolutely terrible said debates and discussions almost always end up becoming. But like an olive branch after a terrible storm, or a Pepsi can before a police riot, there's one show that pretty much everyone can agree as being one of the best, if not the best, things that Cartoon Network has ever done. Over the Garden Wall premiered 10 years ago as a 5-night miniseries event, airing 2 episodes a night between November 3rd and November 7th. Labeled as a mystery in most of the old trailers I can find, though trying to confine it to just one genre is a bit of a disservice in itself. Sure, there's a big mystery element that keeps viewers guessing and wondering as to the nature of the unknown, and how brothers Wirt and Greg ended up here. But it's also a comedy, a horror, a fairy tale, a fable, and a musical all rolled into a gorgeously animated package, evoking old-timey cartoons, vintage Americana, Victorian Gothic aesthetics, and so much more into a relatively small package that you wonder how they were able to do as much as they did, when it feels like big-budget movies provide half as much with twice the time. Such a mishmash of styles and an appeal to a nostalgia that many recognize, even if they've never experienced it, made Over the Garden Wall instantly stand out among its already colorful peers. And even after a decade since it first graced the humble TV screen, there are still plenty of people who regard it as a modern-day masterpiece, and one of the best animated shows ever made. But what exactly makes Over the Garden Wall such a beloved hit in the eyes of so many? I don't really have to tell you, do I? I mean, ignoring the fact that anyone who clicked on a video like this is probably already well aware of the show and how great it is. It's been 10 years. The legacy of its quality must be fairly well known to anyone who's even dabbled in animation. Hell, the show's creator was even handpicked by Guillermo del frickin' Toro to help pen the screenplay for his retelling of Pinocchio because he openly adored it so much. I kind of joked about it before, but it also really does feel like one of the only shows to never pop up in animation discourse flame wars and the like. Seriously, when was the last time you saw someone ballsy enough to drop Over the Garden Wall is garbage and here's why? They would be run off the internet with literal torches and pitchforks.
Young man, go to the dunce box.
It's short, it's sweet, it's a visual feast for the eyes stuffed with some of the best talent Cartoon Network and the voice acting industry can provide. And I really don't need to prattle on as I normally do describing how good it is because it more than speaks for itself. Still, as its 10-year anniversary only comes once, I figured I had to say something to talk about why I love it so much. But to try and describe why feels more impossible than any task a shadowy eldritch beast could provide to intentionally catch me out. Still, as Greg observes, any task is possible if you set your mind to it. So, I'll give it a go.
Into the unknown.
Let me start with a rhetorical question. Where were you 10 years ago? You probably can't remember specifics, right? What you might have been thinking, what you might have been wearing. Hell, I can't even remember what I was doing 10 minutes ago, let alone 10 years. So if you asked me where or when I first found out about Over the Garden Wall, I probably couldn't give you any specifics. Just the memory of seeing a few of the teasers and trailers from various Cartoon Network bumpers at the time. But I do remember being very intrigued, if nothing else. This would mark the very first miniseries they had ever done, and the tone and feel of the animation promised something akin to the old Halloween specials I used to watch as a kid. And hey, Elijah Wood's in it. That's pretty cool.
Do you wear wigs?
No, I do not.
Have you worn wigs?
No, I have not.
Will you wear wigs?
Maybe.
When will you wear wigs?
I don't even remember if I caught it on its first night, but I know I set my DVR to record it, and at least watched the first 4 episodes with my older sister on night 2, and we were both instantly hooked. Through each new location, each new kooky character, to each twist and turn the boys' adventures provided, we were there each night to watch it all unfold, and even before the show was over, I became obsessed with it. When my little sister came home from college for winter break, I introduced her to it. I told basically everyone I knew on the internet to go watch it. Yeah, all 3 of them. And when the DVD came out a year or so later, I snatched that sucker up the first chance I got, and spent the following Halloween watching it in full as I handed out candy to trick-or-treaters. Even before the DVD was out, this show was one of the few things I ever used my old iTunes account for because I just had to have it in some way or form. And I didn't know how to torrent yet.
I want to steal.
What? You guys are bonkers.
Even now that time has passed and I'm not quite as obsessed with it as I was in its heyday, that doesn't mean my affection for this show has waned. One look at the gorgeous backgrounds or one listen to the soundtrack by the Blasting Company is more than enough to take me back to that first week I saw it. And I'm still noticing little details I never had before to keep my admiration and adoration alive and well. Almost like my own lantern I've been keeping lit all this time. And perhaps the real genius of this show is setting it in that mid-autumn, Halloween to early winter phase in terms of its color scheme and aesthetic, because that all but guarantees it entering yearly rotation among the holiday classics, like The Legend of Sleepy Hollow or It's the Great Pumpkin Charlie Brown.
Oh, good grief.
The other genius of the show is in its direct evocation of the past. Pat McHale frequently cites inspiration for the show in old 30s cartoons and Disney movies, German expressionist films, old comedy serials, vintage postcards, Washington Irving stories, colonialist architecture and farmlands. Basically the most visually appealing parts of the past, far and not too distant, meshed into one fantasy setting called the unknown, that evokes the same confusing, cozy, and foreboding feeling as seen in places like Wonderland or Oz. And our heroes coming across a different cast of characters with each episode also draw parallels to the episodic nature in the Alice or Dorothy adventures. There's enough evocation of the past that even if you've never set foot in an antique shop or have only the vaguest memories of old-fashioned cartoons, there's still enough that something about the feel of the show will draw some kind of nostalgia from you. Pat McHale sums up the intent of the show with just that in the commentary for the DVD. An appeal to a sense of nostalgia that may not even be based on your own memories. A pristine and crisp autumn that probably never existed, but nonetheless feels like autumn to you. To name one example on my part, I never saw that Shirley Temple movie where she sings about animal crackers that Potatoes and Molasses is directly cribbing from. But we had a sing-along VHS tape that included it among other vintage songs from old 20th Century Fox movies. And I'd seen enough of those Shirley Temple DVD collection commercials to instantly know what they were going for. You know, in all this time, I've never actually tried Potatoes and Molasses together. Might as well remedy that now. Oh, no. Speaking more about Pat McHale, it's worth talking a little bit about what led him to creating Over the Garden Wall, and his history with other high-profile Cartoon Network shows leading up to it. Hailing from Chatham, New Jersey, Pat McHale moved to Los Angeles in 2002 to attend the California Institute of the Arts, earning a BFA in character animation 4 years later. He received his first job at Cartoon Network as a writer and storyboard artist for The Marvelous Misadventures of Flapjack, a surreal little show that I honestly never really got into myself, but whose talents include some fairly scrappy individuals like J.G. Quintel, Alex Hirsch, and Pendleton Ward. On the latter show, Adventure Time, Pat McHale would once again serve as a writer and storyboarder for a good chunk of its run, and as a creative director for the first 2 seasons up until his move to New York in 2012. Not for nothing, but a lot of the quirks in Over the Garden Wall make a lot of sense when you look into some of the stuff Pat McHale is responsible for on Adventure Time, not the least of which includes co-creating the frickin' Lich.
Fall.
The sheer conglomerate of talent on shows like Flapjack and Adventure Time can't be overstated, and it was with some of this great talent that Pat McHale saw one of his oldest visions come to life: Tome of the Unknown. Though the basic gist of 2 brothers finding themselves lost in a limbo-esque world called the Unknown has always been consistent, the story beats and what drives them through each misadventure was quite different with each new iteration. For Tome, the original pitched Bible involved Wirt, Greg, Greg's frog, and their companion bird guide named Beatrice, traveling through exotic locales to find lost pages of the Tome of the Unknown, a book that contained the stories of everything that had come before or after, and might hold the clue to send them home. Much of this original pitch, as well as a rough idea of the original 10 episodes, can be found in Over the Garden Wall's art book, which I'm also basing a good chunk of my research off of. Just go buy it, it's great. Which also reveals that this first pitch exists as far back as 2006. It wasn't until Pat showed his stuff on Flapjack and Adventure Time that Cartoon Network ordered a pilot for 2013, culminating in Harvest Melody, which the network chose over Pat's first choice for the pilot, The Ringing of the Bell, since they deemed it too scary. And I know that sometimes networks can be a little dumb in their executive decisions, but considering all that happens in that episode...
I'm sorry, my turtles, but I must...
Yeah, they made the right choice. Some of the artists from Pat's prior jobs include Susan Mont, AT's background painter who served as Tome's art director, Eric Elizares, a cleanup artist for Flapjack providing the same talents for Tome, and Phil Rinda, the lead character designer for AT, who created the models for the Unknown's Core 4. Just as many, if not more artists, ended up coming from outside the Cartoon Network studio, with many freelance artists like Chris Sergiotis, who did the background designs, and the man hired as background painter, who would end up being integral to the distinct style of the show proper, Nick Cross. Cross is an independent animator from Canada, whose short films like The Pig Farmer and conceptual feature-length idea Black Sunrise impressed McHale a great deal. And glancing at the style for both those and the rest of what he's posted on his YouTube channel, it kind of gives me a what if John Kay wasn't a complete piece of shit vibe. For the pilot, Nick likened the backgrounds drawn by Sergiotis to old Disney layouts from the 40s, spending an inordinate amount of time perfecting the vintage feel of the art. A level of dedication you normally don't get on a regular episode of a TV cartoon, let alone for a pilot. This doesn't mean that backgrounds or paintwork for TV is all garbage or anything. I can name plenty of shows where it's genuinely amazing what they managed to do given the quick turnaround of network cartoons. But even for some of the best looking shows out there, you still more or less see similar locations for the bulk of their runtime. And the detail isn't quite as extravagant as you might see in a feature animated film or the like. With Tome and especially Over the Garden Wall, the team could afford to splurge a little on the design because they knew how short it was going to be, and that every episode would feature a new locale. So Cross didn't feel as burdened to limit himself as much as he normally might on a show like this. And that level of detail definitely went a long way for the pilot, and for his promotion to art director for the show proper. Even in a relatively simplified form compared to what would follow, Tome of the Unknown is absolutely dripping in style and atmosphere, feeling like a moving postcard brought to life like an old cartoon, with so much more going on than the typical animated pilot that I would be genuinely concerned for any studio that didn't immediately pick it up for a full series. Which, thankfully, Cartoon Network was wise enough to do, with even more talent from their flagship shows joining the fun. Burt Young, Tom Herpich, Steve Wolfhard, So Kim, Natasha Allegri, Cole Sanchez, Pendleton Ward, and plenty more that would ensure this wasn't going to be just any run-of-the-mill special. This was going to be frickin' legendary. Let me ask a follow-up hypothetical question. Who were you 10 years ago? 10 years ago was, as you might expect, an entirely different time for yours truly. I was in that strange transitional period between teenage and proper adult years that we in the business call 20. I was still in college, juggling an online philosophy course and an in-person creative writing class. Still not really certain what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. Feeling like I was some kind of boat upon a winding river, twisting towards an endless black sea, further and further away from where I wanted to be, who I wanted to be. Perhaps it was for that reason Over the Garden Wall spoke to me. Wirt and Greg either entering or stuck in a similar transitory period of their lives between child and young adulthood. The unknown itself being in a constant transitory state between autumn and winter, joy and fear, life and death. Of course, it's not like I would have been smart enough to make that connection at 20, but it was probably a subconscious reason why the show stuck out to me when I finally saw it, beyond all the other perfectly valid reasons one might watch it. The spectacular animation, the gorgeous music and songs, the all-star cast filled with some pretty big-name talent like the aforementioned Elijah Wood, Christopher Lloyd, Melanie Linsky, Shirley Jones, Jack Jones, Tim Curry, and...
Come everyone, let us retire to the parlor and enjoy my unnecessary excess of wealth and luxury.
Man, you remember when you used to like John Cleese showing up everywhere?
It's almost as though I've lost my mind.
But even ignoring all that, most people can probably attest that the first episode alone was enough to get them to sit through the whole thing. Of course, the goal for any first episode is to convince you to watch the rest of the show, but the first episode, The Old Grist Mill, is about as perfect an introduction as you could ever get for a show like this. Even ignoring the intro melody, impossible as that is, the first minute establishes a strong sense of character with Wirt, the anxious and melancholy older brother, and Greg, the energetic and cheerful younger brother, and his pet frog, wandering through a creepy forest as it slowly dawns on them that they're hopelessly lost. The next minute adding to the mystery with a talking bird offering to guide them home, then flying away at the first sign of trouble. That being a cantankerous woodsman, frantically warning them about a beast that wanders these woods. Such effective and gripping storytelling all within a few short minutes, and such beautifully creepy animation on top of it all. And that's before the supposed beast in question even shows up.
You have beautiful eyes.
If there was ever a better case for burying the lead in a story like this, I certainly can't think of it. The closest example in my mind is probably the first episode of Disney Channel's Amphibia, which features a similar premise of a young teen thrust into a fantasy setting where it's not immediately apparent to the audience how they got there, the revelation only coming much later into the story, nearly at the very end in Over the Garden Wall's case. And while I think you probably could have started this show with Wirt explaining how they got there to the woodsman as per the original plan, and still end up with more or less the same high quality, I find that such a reveal is much more satisfying when we have something to compare it to. When we can watch the last episode of Amphibia's Season 1 and see the contrast between who Anne was before all her character development. Or share in Wirt's realization that it was his own fear of the unknown that led him to the unknown. But maybe that's putting the cart before the horse.
Nice to horse your acquaintance.
Even without the context of what drove them to the woodsman's repurposed mill, running for their lives and nearly devoured by a candy-hungry dog turned massive and bloodthirsty beast.
The dog? That is not the beast!
Episode 1 establishes the conflict for the rest of the show going forward so sublimely. Greg is a bit too careless in his happy-go-lucky wonder of the world. The candy trail he made inadvertently driving the dog to a feral state, and leading it right to them. Whereas Wirt, rather than keeping an eye on his younger brother or stepping up to protect him when he was in danger, left him to wander around when he was annoying him, and ran away without bothering to make sure he was safe. The woodsman rightfully chewing him out for his recklessness.
You are the elder child. You are responsible for you and your brother's actions.
Maybe I can fix it? I can't fix it.
This clash of personalities between the two brothers will only continue as the show goes on. Not helped once the bluebird Beatrice returns and offers them a way home through Adelaide of the pasture, trying to guide them to her as best she can despite Wirt's hesitancy, and Greg.
Beatrice, would you care for this dance?
No thanks. No thanks. No thanks. I said no thank you.
From here on, every episode sees the boys hopping from one adventure to the next, attending a school for animals, helping a love-struck eccentric rich guy, meeting a sickly girl forcibly put to menial labor by her auntie Whispers, who is...
Has anyone come here today?
a problem. And here is where the episodic nature of the show really benefited its original release schedule. The show as a whole is short enough, just under 2 hours, where you could watch it all in one sitting, as I most often do nowadays. But during its premiere week, episodes were released 2 at a time in a half-hour block, giving you just a taste of the overarching narrative, mixed with whatever smaller narrative the group had stumbled upon. And more often than not, the even-numbered episodes would leave off with a cliffhanger that you just had to see fulfilled, such as our first sighting of the beast at the end of episode 4, or the revelation in episode 6 that Adelaide of the pasture is not the so-called good woman of the woods that Beatrice claimed her to be. Here is also where the show's twist nature is steadily revealed, as each episode features what could be a relatively straightforward story of a cult of creepy pumpkin-wearing villagers, or a crazy old man who did away with the real lady of the mansion he's squatting in. But nothing in the unknown is as it first seems, and often the most dangerous or creepy-looking individuals are far from the actual danger the boys have to worry about.
For some reason, I thought that old lady was the people eater, but it was Lorna all along. It just goes to show you stuff.
Can you imagine if a show like this was made in today's streaming climate? To be dumped on Max or most likely Amazon Prime because they can't even handle their own properties at this point? No build-up or intrigue between episodes and basically no hype for its actual release? Like I said, most people nowadays are more than likely to watch it all in one sitting, and that's fine. But there was something uniquely special about the 2-episode-a-night structure it had for its debut. The kind of special, serialized structure that only a semi-traditional TV release can provide. Talking about serialization, though, it's probably more apt to compare Over the Garden Wall to theatrical animated shorts of the golden years of animation, of which many serve as yet another visual inspiration. Heck, episode 8 more or less plays out exactly the way one of these old shorts would. And though it shares its name specifically with the silly symphony Babes in the Woods, it more or less follows the structure of every classical musical short of that era. A character is introduced to a fantastical setting, the characters faff about most often in a musical number, until an antagonist enters to give them some form of conflict before they're soundly defeated and the characters rejoice.
Are there more? Well, that's enough.
What helps the show stay fresh, even throughout its short runtime, is how different each new episode feels from the last. Though they form a cohesive whole and even feature similar plot and character beats, comparing episode 3 to episode 7 is like trying to compare potatoes to molasses. Heck, Heck, even just comparing episode 3 to episode 4 is almost jarring for how literally night and day they are. With one pastiching the comedic stylings of old serials like Our Gang, and the other being like the start of a Washington Irving-inspired D&D session. You enter a dimly lit tavern filled with assorted, surly guests, and a tavern keeper who looks like Betty Boop.
And that's a horse.
It's also a boon to the character writing that even the misadventures serve to flesh out the dynamics between Wirt, Greg, and Beatrice as their journey through the unknown goes on, with important character details being revealed gradually about all of them, and they dissect the common molds of their archetypes, so that by the time we reach the thrilling climax of episode 10, we've more than come to know and love these characters, and how they've grown through each mishap and misadventure. Greg's tendency to do more than plan leads him to save the school for animals they stumble upon, even when he dismisses the institution at first in favor of some ragamuffin fun with fellow delinquent youths. Though this is also dissected when his detour in the Cloud City leaves Wirt susceptible to the beast's influence, nearly costing him his life. Beatrice acts as a snarky guide for the Lost Brothers, trying to keep them focused and push them along the path to the pasture without getting too attached, and especially butting heads with Wirt in particular.
It's stuck. Well, guess we have to spend some quality time together.
But despite her best efforts, comes to genuinely love the two brothers, and do whatever she can to genuinely make amends for betraying them. And Wirt, dear Wirt, begins the series as an overly passive, overly anxious, and overly awkward young adult who tries way too hard to be something he's not. Mainly, anything that isn't him.
Greg, don't you want to be more like your brother? Just always doing what you're told?
Huh?
Just a pathetic pushover who relies on others to make all his decisions?
Hey, what?
This is also where the great subtext of the show comes in, especially with how the unknown works, or rather, how it doesn't. There's a dreamlike quality to the setting and its rules that doesn't really hold up to scrutiny if you examine it closely. How can a toy boat sent down the river become large enough to carry dozens of human-sized frogs? How do two different rich people build their extravagant mansions so massively that they don't even notice when they build into each other? How can the brothers walk for miles and miles away from the old grist mill and find their way back towards it near the end of the show?
How can you walk away from something and still come back to it?
Walk around the world.
Small world.
These are all perfectly valid questions you might have if you really sat down and tried to analyze the plot in a mechanical fashion. But much like with Wonderland or any other setting that draws inspiration from it, there's no atlas or concrete map to guide you through it. The setting is dictated based on the needs of the story itself. And the true genius of Over the Garden Wall is that you don't really care about the logic as it pertains to the real world. Even before you find out in the penultimate episode that Greg and Wirt hail from the not-too-distant past circa late 70s to early 80s, you still buy into the ever-changing logic of the unknown because it's so effective in its execution. And when you do get that context that Wirt and Greg are from the real world, the illogic of it all starts to make genuine sense. There's little clues throughout episode 9 that a lot of what makes the unknown tick pertains to how the two brothers view the world and what they know about it. From the headstone in the Eternal Garden Graveyard that features Quincy Endicott's name, to the brief mention of the game Two Old Cat that Greg literally thinks involves two old cats.
I think that cat is too old.
This is also where Wirt's insecurities about himself manifest, where up until this point we've gotten the impression that he's a bottom-rung loser, hopelessly in love with a girl way cooler than he'll ever be. But when we see him interact with his peers, they all seem to know and at least like him to some degree. Especially his crush, who appears pretty eager to invite him to go to the graveyard along with her friends, to hang out and drink age-appropriate drinks.
Like juice?
Yeah, and whatever. Age-appropriate stuff that's not illegal.
Wirt wants to appear like he knows what he's doing, to have the confidence of a classical hero, and though he might form something of a plan if given enough time, more often than not, he reacts based on emotion to an even worse degree than Greg. The costume he haphazardly puts together has no real rhyme or reason to it beyond trying to look cool and mysterious. He immediately backs out of his attempts to impress his crush with a tape he made, and all his efforts to get it back before she can listen to its dreaded contents.
That tape has got poetry and clarinet on it, Greg. Poetry and clarinet!
Ultimately end up leading them into the unknown itself, when Wirt hops over the garden wall, rather than face his fears.
Oh, once again, you ruined my life.
This, in turn, plays into Wirt's self-serving and self-defeating memory, to the point where his confession to Beatrice during their heart-to-heart near the midway of the show involves his deepest, darkest secret not only being his huge crush on Sarah back home, but that he's also into the clarinet and likes reciting poetry to himself at night.
Wirt, that stuff's not weird. Those are just, well, the poetry thing is weird, but those are just character traits.
Seeing how Sarah seems to enjoy Wirt's company, it's likely she'd probably agree with Beatrice's assessment. But Wirt is too intimidated by the idea that he might fail and make a fool of himself to take the chance, and too intimidated by another boy vying for her attention. Jason Funderberker.
And then Jason Funderberker comes out of nowhere and whisks her away. Ugh, Jason Funderberker.
Jason Funderberker, the pride of Wirt's hometown, the pinnacle of human achievement, a Casanova that effortlessly emits charisma that no mere mortal such as Wirt, nay, any of us, could hope to replicate.
Ugh, that guy's got his act together. He's the total package.
Given the nature of this show and Wirt's self-serving memory being taken to task the entirety of episode 9, it probably shouldn't have been such a surprise that Jason Funderberker would not exactly live up to those expectations. But I still wasn't expecting...
Hey, Sarah. Are you ready to go?
Excusez-moi, je l'aime.
Do you believe in ghosts?
Why?
'Cause there's one right behind you. I'm just kidding.
If there was ever a character I was more rapturous to share my first name with, it's you, Jason Funderberker.
Me?
And sure, we can all laugh at how socially awkward Jason Funderberker is, and how Wirt is so jealous of him he doesn't even notice what a complete nerd he is. But one thing he has that Wirt doesn't is a strong sense of himself. A confidence in who he is and his identity with his friends and peers. And I suppose that's another angle to Over the Garden Wall that I hadn't really considered for the past decade. Sure, I can talk my head off about every other aspect of this show that makes it great, but there's something else to it that probably helps it resonate with so many. For Wirt isn't only on a journey to find his way home, he's on a journey of self-discovery. A quest to find his identity. Episode 4, Songs of the Dark Lantern, is where this theme is at its most apparent. As everyone in the tavern Wirt and Greg find themselves in one stormy night has a strong sense of identity, and a purpose to themselves in the roles they play. The butcher, the tavern keeper, the highwayman.
I'm the highwayman.
Yeah. And when they ask Wirt who he is, he can't really give them a satisfactory answer.
I don't really like labels. I'm just sort of like myself, you know?
Maybe he's simple.
No!
It's not as though any one of these patrons are particularly deep in their own affirmations of who they are beyond what they do for a living. But a passage from the art book that fascinated me was how they equate it to high school, and how everyone has their own little cliques they're in. The jocks, the nerds, the theater kids, the band kids, so on and so forth. Obviously, in real life, people are much more multifaceted than just who they hang out with or what their hobbies are. But to someone Wirt's age, and who has the same anxiety regarding where they belong, it can very much feel like you don't really belong to any group if you don't fit into one solid mold. It's the reason Wirt is so taken to the label that's eventually given to him when he and Greg talk more about their adventures up to this point, the Pilgrim. And why he's more eager to jump into action than usual when it appears that Beatrice is in trouble afterward. This newfound pride also sets up his fall, as when he finds out that Beatrice intended to leave them with Adelaide before her change of heart, he loses all confidence in himself and his ability to ever find their way home, leaving him susceptible to the beast's icy grasp, were it not for Greg, whom Wirt was quick to blame for all their troubles and dismiss right off, willingly taking his place. This culminates in episode 10, where each of the brothers' main vices are addressed. Though Greg's eternal optimism keeps him safe from the beast's typical methods of despair, the almost impossible tasks he gives him drives the young lad to work till exhaustion, until by the time Wirt and Beatrice find him, he's nearly consumed by the edelwood that feeds the Dark Lantern.
Oh, geez, the leaves are even growing inside of him.
No, I was just eating leaves.
Although Wirt takes responsibility for their being in this mess in the first place, Greg has been carrying his own sense of guilt, as his impulsive nature has led him to do some pretty thoughtless stuff, such as stealing a rock from an older neighbor's yard just because he liked it. An action that doesn't sit right with Greg despite his chipper demeanor. Best shown in episode 5 when, after receiving 2 pennies from Quincy Endicott and his lady love as a reward for bringing them together, he immediately throws them away, angrily stating that he has no sense.
No sense at all.
So even Greg, hopeful and giddy as he is, has some unspoken doubts about his own identity, labeling himself as just a dirty thief as he nearly succumbs to the beast. Meanwhile, Wirt, who has struggled with what he wants and who he is for the whole show, finally puts his overactive mind to use when he takes a moment to consider the beast's offer to put Greg's weakening soul in the lantern, saying that as long as it stays lit, he can help Wirt keep him alive.
Wait, that's dumb.
What?
That's dumb. I'm not just gonna wander around in the woods for the rest of my life.
Which finally leads me back to the hypothetical I posed like 50 minutes ago. Who were you 10 years ago? 10 years ago, when I first saw this show, I wasn't entirely sure of my own identity in my new young adult life, and it's not like I got any clear answers in the years that followed. I must have changed my intended career choice at least a dozen times since I was in college, fancying myself a filmmaker, a critic, a writer. Even just this past year alone has been something of a search for an identity in regards to what kind of regular 9-to-5 job I want to sustain me and my family as I hopefully find the time and energy to pursue other hobbies and passions. That's not even getting into the even more personal stuff about myself that I'm still trying to figure out. And it's kind of funny to reflect on where I was 10 years ago and consider the fact that I've made just as many dunderheaded mistakes as Wirt, Greg, or Beatrice in trying to discover my identity. But just like with them, a lot of these mistakes have helped me find a better version of myself despite it all. Though the series ends with Wirt still being a bit of an anxious goob, he has definitely learned from his experience and has at least started to become a better brother to Greg, accepting him for who he is and wanting to be a more active part in his life, even taking co-ownership of his frog.
Our frog.
Our frog.
Our frog.
I don't think it's ever possible to find a true version of yourself, because who you are shifts and changes with every new experience you gain. Who I was 10 years ago when I first saw this show, and who I am today reflecting on it feel like two very different people, yet they're both still me. I don't think I ever could have predicted I'd end up where I am today a decade ago, or how my sense of identity would shift as it has. But I think, in the end, I'm satisfied with it. Satisfied that though I've made some mistakes and will no doubt make even more, I think I'm on the right path through the unknown. And it's nice that in all that time, I've had a show like this to keep coming back to. A show that keeps you fascinated in its many mysteries, its intentionally vague world building, and its constant devotion to making you look for the deeper meaning beyond the surface level. It's also kind of amusing to think about, but in a way, it sort of becomes nostalgic in and of itself because of how tied into the past it is. How it makes you remember the distant parts of your childhood. The old Halloween specials and movies. The antique and vintage art and animation on display. Its strong evocation of all things old-timey, and almost tricks you into thinking that it's always been part of your past. An old childhood favorite, no matter how old you were when you first found it. And in the end, that's what nostalgia really is. How the gentle wind beckons through the leaves as autumn colors fall, dancing in a swirl of golden memories.
The loveliest lies of all.